I guess this is the Grief of Politics episode 2. We have art now.
I don't know that I'd say I guess. I mean, this is
definitely. Yeah, this is the podcast. Yeah.
Yes.
We'll get better at this. I'm used to talking to no one, Avin, and you're used to not podcasting, so this will go great. The first 3 episodes.
Both are true.
Yeah, so this is episode 2, and Avin and I both decided we're going to do a political podcast. We're going to talk about the issues instead of complaining about the news, because there's a lot of podcasts that do that. I'm sure there's podcasts that talk about the issues too, but they're probably, as the term is coined, they are policy wonks. I am not one of those, meaning people that deep dive into policy and talk about procedures, and I don't do that. I don't know. You don't really do that much, Avin.
No.
So I got the website kind of in a weird, it's a template, and I've started affecting it. I do have to get a separate feed for the podcast because I don't want it on my feed. That's not a criticism of the podcast. I just know that people probably don't want to subscribe to one and get 2 podcasts. They may not be interested in politics, or they may not be interested in grief or whatever. So, or my gaming. They may not be interested in gaming. So I'll make them a separate feed. We have art. I think we have to come up with a theme tune next, and I'll be giving you all that info, Avin, if you have to log into the.
Just don't make it beep bop boop.
No, I'm not. I don't think it's going to be techno. There was actually, I guess, on GarageBand, there's a lot of songs you can use for free, and there was like kind of a jazzy news thing, and I was like, well, yeah, it's and there's some that sound very. I'll probably send you some samples. You can actually go on GarageBand and. Maybe what I'll do is I'll just send you a list of the ones I thought were good, and then you have GarageBand. You could listen to them and go, I don't like that one. I like this one. It's all in their sample section or whatever. I used it when Ben, you and I did the podcast, but I didn't write down the one I used, and so I used like 3 different ones. So people were like, "What, did they change music again?" Like I just kept like going between tracks.
I mean, let's just be honest. Like the 4 people that listened to those early on podcasts probably didn't really care.
Oh wow, you think it was 4? You think it got up to 4? I don't think it got up to 4, man. Yeah, so I guess we said it a little bit the first episode, but you and I, we don't always see eye to eye with policy, but, there is stuff we agree on. And I just wanted to do police reform because we did talk about it at the end of last episode a little bit. It was like the very end of the episode. You said something about, you said it's surprising that your conservative friends believe in teachers' unions and how powerful they are, but once you start talking, well, I'm paraphrasing, once they start talking about police unions, they get very uninterested in reform or anything like that.
Actually, it was more along the lines of most of my conservative friends, and for that matter, the large conservative community as a whole, strongly desires either breaking up or putting more control in on teachers' unions, and yet is totally not okay with police unions.
Right. Which is strange. Because
totally not okay with putting controls on police through police unions.
Right.
Which, to be fair, the purpose of a union is to do that. Like, that's why we have unions, to protect the people that are in that union and their jobs as much as possible.
Right. But what I saw, and to be clear, I think unless we state it, we're probably going to use 3 sources per episode. So the source I used, one of the sources is from the New York Times. It came out, it was published on June 20th, 2020. Oh, I'm sorry. It was published on June 6th, 2020. It was updated on the 20th. And it was called How Police Unions Became Such Powerful Opponents to Reform Efforts by Noam Schreiber and Farah Stockham, and with help with J. David Goodman. So you can read along if you want to read that article. That's the first. I think we'll just start there because that was the first thing I sent you. What was surprising about that article to you, if anything at all was surprising?
Well, remember, I only listened to the podcast. I didn't read the articles.
Oh, no. Okay, so I will paraphrase it a little bit. Basically, it said that, I mean, I'm not going to go over the whole article, but the idea was that every time some official, even some conservative officials, tried to make some kind of reform, the union would push back. And in some cases, as we saw with like the George Floyd incident last summer, in the summer of 2020, they would not respond to calls, or they would slow their response time to calls in areas. So they would purposely say like, oh, you have a beef with us? We're just going to slow down response time to incidents.
Interesting.
Let me,
okay, like is this? How are they quantifying that?
Let me find. For
Where's
some reason, I took tons of notes on the other two things, and the notes. I'll just put how. People could probably hear me typing right now.
I can.
Let's see if it comes up. How? There we go. Oh yeah, right here. So.
Where did you email me at? I don't have those. I know I got
Hotmail?
them. Oh, right. The one email I don't use.
Oh, you use it? No, I thought I did Yahoo.
I thought
Should
you
have
did
it in
too,
Yahoo.
but I'm not finding it there.
Well, I did it directly from their site, because they have a link to share at their site. So I think,
I mean, I might have just nuked it because I'd never read anything from the New York Times. No, I know I didn't. I just don't know where it's at in here.
Oh yeah, so there was this one incident. So, so remember during the George Floyd protests, there was an old man that was pushed down by police. It was on the news.
Mm-hmm.
The police were in riot gear. It says the president of the police union in Buffalo, and I'm reading from the article from the New York Times. The president of the police union in Buffalo said the union stood 100% behind two officers who were suspended on Thursday after appearing to push an older man who fell and suffered head injuries. I mean, there was film of that.
Yep.
The union president said the officers were simply following orders. All 57 officers of the emergency response team, a special squad formed to respond to riots, had resigned from their posts on the team in support of the suspended officers.
Okay.
Unions can be so effective at defending their members that cops with a pattern of abuse can be left untouched. So that's one instance. I remember reading about that.
I do as well. Like that in that particular instance got a ton of press, like a ton of press. The and for good reason, right? The old guy was challenging the officers and yelling at the officers, and the officers shoved him, and of course he fell and hit his head and was pretty injured. But that's not related to the question I had asked, which I don't want to minimize this point of the conversation, but I was really curious about your conversation.
I read a lot of articles before this, so I can't find that where they said they would slow response times, but it might have been another article I read, so I don't want to bring that into it. But there does seem to be this immense pushback, which you didn't read the other article, but that actually goes into the other article, which we'll get into. But I think my problem is, like you said, there should, even in unions, there should be accountability. I talked to a friend of mine was in a union, or he's in a union now, and even though he has problems with the union, he said, it's difficult to get fired, but you can get fired.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, there needs to be accountability in these things, and it's difficult to just keep reading these things. It's been brought up several times, but Derek Chauvin had several counts of misconduct against him. And the fact that as the public, we don't know what that is, or that they talk about it in the last article we're going to go over. They talk about how, you can be fired from a police department in a city, have your file buried and then go get a job somewhere else.
Well, even in the podcast you'd shared, I can't remember the chief's name at the moment, but I mean, he talked about.
Oh, Norm Stamper?
Yeah, Stamper. I remember
Yeah,
Norm. I couldn't remember Stamper.
Yeah, I kept calling him Donald Stamper, which is probably not. But I wrote it down.
He.
Do you want to talk? Do you want to talk about the podcast now?
Well, no. I'm just reinforcing kind of what you're getting at. Norm Stamper talks about officer getting fired from a small police department for some level of misconduct. Actually, for misusing his gun at the range, and they called him too much of a liability. And then he went off to Cleveland, and this was the incident with the young boy that was shot.
Oh, right.
And Cleveland had no idea what he'd done, Cleveland PD, so they hired him. And he went out and killed a kid. Terribly tragic situation. I 100% understand the perception of the officers in the incident. The kid had an extremely believable gun, but on the same note, like, he was 12?
Yeah. Well, that's the problem. Like, that other police department could look at his file and say, I don't know, man, you need to do like a psych eval, and we're going to have you be on a desk and do some paperwork for a while till we can evaluate if you can be in the field. And then some of that stuff could have got mitigated, instead of him just going out and not telling anybody and not, there probably is some weird regulation where they're like, well, I can't really tell you, why I got fired from the, but when you're a police officer, you should be incredibly forthcoming or have to be.
And for that matter, by law in most states, if not nationally, if I get fired from a job and apply to another job, and the company I'm applying to calls the other company, that company cannot, by law, tell where I'm applying why they fired me. All they can say is I am rehirable or not rehirable. And the other company from there has to make the decision.
Yeah, I mean, but you and I don't, carry firearms in our jobs. So you'd think if you carried firearms and protected a neighborhood, they'd have a higher level of scrutiny than...
Correct.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of recommendation and a lot of discussion nationally right now about creating some form of officer registry. Norm Stamper talked about the...
By the way, just interrupt you. So the podcast I sent you, the podcast is called Future Hindsight, and the host is Mila Atmos, and she had a guest, the former police chief of Seattle, Norm Stamper. And the episode debuted December 3rd, 2020. You can subscribe to the podcast if you like it. And I just thought it was kind of interesting because we were talking about this, and I just got recommended the podcast like a week ago, 2 weeks ago. And then it just hit my feed that like, hey, they're talking to Norm Stamper. I was like, wow, how, because we're in Washington State. So it was like, oh, that's kind of kismet a little bit. So he's written several books. But go ahead, sorry. I just wanted to give context for what we're
100%
randomly talking about a podcast. Like,
cite sources. About? That's not a bad thing.
Yeah. Again, this is episode 2. We'll get better.
He talked about creating some form of a national licensing process or something for police officers.
Yeah.
So that there would be some level of accountability, or like if your license got pulled, not just you got fired, but your license got pulled, like you couldn't go be a police officer somewhere else. Now,
right.
Any union, not just police union, any union is going to defend against that because that's their responsibility to protect their members. That's the purpose of unions, right? As a whole, I think all unions are overpowered in this capacity, not just police or teacher. I understand the purpose and the reason for unions, and it's because humans are morally corrupt people if we don't put rules in place.
What? Come on, Avin. We have other episodes we got to go over. We can't.
If we don't put rules in place, then people will take advantage of other people. And at the end of the day, like, if you need a job, you need a job. So if you create a registry like that, an officer gets fired in a city like Seattle for doing something that a city like Seattle would see as egregious because we are a very woke culture in our area. And then he applies to some place like Dallas, where that's not a culturally inappropriate thing to do, but his license is pulled. He can never be an officer again. I don't know that that's necessarily fair. Still, I don't necessarily disagree that there shouldn't be some level of transparency in police work, because there is an inherent risk if an officer does something extremely stupid or dangerous or harmful in one city and then just goes somewhere else and is left free to do it again in the future, which is exactly what happened in this case. I do not remember the name of the officer in that situation.
Whoa. No, but I mean, it happens all over. Like that third article we're going to talk about. I do want to talk about the Norm Stamper thing, because that was like really interesting. Like, he did say like he actually kind of celebrates the idea of defunding the police because, and then he brought up statistics of like, like we randomly brought up, I don't know if it was the first podcast or just you and I just talking, because we talk so much about politics, but it was the idea that, a lot of cops, they're not doing things they should be doing as police officers. They're responding to calls of,
Correct.
Things they shouldn't do. And it's like we should have a psychologist or a nurse or something go do that and take care of that, and then they're able to focus on robberies and, murder and arson and like all these things that are important, part of the community.
So Snohomish County, where I live, a couple of years ago did an experiment. Maybe it was several years, and they ran it for a couple of years, where they started putting social workers in with certain officers.
Oh, yeah, I tried to find an article on that. I remember reading that, and I couldn't really find any. I did search for a while. I couldn't find anything. Like an actual, like, here's the stats that we got from this program.
And it was extremely successful. Basically, what ended up happening when officers ran into someone who was homeless, I don't know what the PC phrase is nowadays, so I'm going to use homeless at the moment. Not to denigrate the people. They are human, but that's the word I know.
Yeah, I know. I understand. There is a new word. But I don't remember what it is.
Which is a...
Well, we're not. I mean, we're not making fun of homeless. We're not making fun of homeless people. We're just saying they are without a home.
Correct.
That is the reality of their situation.
What is it? Unhoused?
Yeah, I think something unhomed or
yeah. Anyway, whenever they would run into an instance with someone who was homeless or a drug addict or anything else along those lines, the social worker was there with the officer to immediately offer services and then get them into services right away. And the success rate was way higher because those people were already at the lowest point with an officer intervention. I'm okay with that. In fact, I think that's extremely intelligent. On the flip side of it, I don't think if we go through this whole defund the police movement that sending out just the social worker is smart, because
no,
they're going to get hurt. There's going to be an extremely high level of injured social workers out there, and they're going to be scared and they're not going to want to do the work.
I don't know if it's just social workers. Like I've also, again, I don't have a source, but I've read, I think it was that same thing, like having nurses and things that work in hospitals, because they said, we have de-escalation training, and so, yeah, there's violent things that happen in a hospital, but we're able to de-escalate the situation, which is good. And
well, and they don't have any other choice,
right? And so the thing
Nurses
is,
aren't
it's like maybe
guns.
Right, but then so maybe you do like a partner situation, so that way one of the officers, that you wouldn't have two officers on a call as partners, you would have, so that frees up the other officer to do like the other police work.
That idea brings up the inherent flaw in the concept of defund the police,
right?
And like. In Seattle, we're still having mass protests. Like, there was a justified police shooting last week in Seattle. At least in my opinion, it was justified. And
I actually didn't.
Many people in the community, including a commentator from Converge Media, Omari Salisbury, were not calling this out as a police issue. And what ended up happening was two girls in a neighborhood in Seattle that it wasn't the neighborhood they know, and it was actually near the African American Heritage Museum. I could be wrong. Anyway, it was two young girls in their 20s were in their car, and this person who does already have a past walked up and shot both of them. Shot one of them 3 times in the face and killed her, and then shot the other one. And when police showed up...
So they had a gun, basically. They were violent and had a gun.
Correct. And when police showed up, because they got the panicked emergency call asking for medics, when police showed up, the shooter came around the corner with the gun, aimed it at the officers. It's visible in the camera, in the body cam, and they unloaded on him. which
Yeah, I mean that
I don't want to watch
that's-
that. I haven't watched the video because I don't want to watch that. The point being, though, is in Seattle, they're now having protests about how this is excessive force and we need it 100%, and they're demanding that they 100% defund the police, and that's not going to solve it.
Right. Well, it's the idea, too, that everybody is in a heightened state of alert, and everybody's talked about this, because of everything that's been going on. Now the police are in a heightened state of alert, and not to say that person shouldn't have been shot or taken out or whatever, but, there is people on the left that would say, well, what about, I mean, I don't know if they had time. I don't know this. I haven't watched a video either, but what about tasing and all this stuff? What did you have to shoot him? But like it's been pointed out several times, because of police training, you're trained to shoot to the ground, basically, to shoot.
You were trained to shoot to kill.
Yeah, you're trained to shoot until they stop literally moving, So, that kind of stuff doesn't, it doesn't upset me as much. And one thing I think it was interesting that, I think that gets forgotten about all this is, Norm Stamper said in the podcast, he said the police are the community and the community are the police, that they have to work together. And I think that gets lost in the shuffle, especially nowadays with, all the protests we've seen and everything. It's more of an adversarial relationship, but as many people on the left have pointed out, there's this kind of social contract that we all agree that okay, you're going to protect my neighborhood and stuff. You're not going to use excessive force. But then if you see people use excessive force, then it's okay, well, you've broken that contract and now I can no longer trust you and I'm not going to work with you to snitch, basically, because you haven't shown me a level of respect or anything like that. And again, I think, there's a lot, the Norm Stamper thing, I took tons of notes in, but
there's a lot to unpack in that.
Yeah, he said it was difficult to reform the police because, they're a product of the culture which they come from. And
he talked about being a part of a couple of attempts to reform police officers and some other stuff along those lines, too. And, a point he kind of made, but maybe I'm ad-libbing it a little bit, but it essentially, we talk about the militarization of police.
Yeah, he did. I mentioned that's one of my last notes. Is he said it's just getting it's getting out of hand.
Well, and so what ends up happening is that one party escalates, the other party escalates, and then when one party escalates, then the next one has to escalate, and it continues to escalate back and forth, right? Criminal elements, police elements, and I 100% understand the police motivation to do it. They are doing a job. They're protecting their community. They want to go home to their wives and kids at the end of the night. So
yeah, I disagree a little bit because it's a thing where I'm, again, not condoning riot or looting or anything like that. But imagine you're a rioter and a looter and you see an APC roll into town like in Ferguson with people with, you'd be like, what is happening? And then to me, and it's such a terrible thing. I brought up to you, it's kind of a source. Vice did a story on obviously the ongoing protests, and they went to Portland, and the reporter was African American, and there was a Black Lives Matter rally, and then it turned violent, and the police there were in Portland, and he was with an activist, and all the Black Lives Matter people were there, just using a bullhorn, talking about why they were there. They weren't violent, and then the cops came out, and then the protesters, not the Black Lives Matter people, but these Antifa protesters, started riling up the police. Then the police started shooting tear gas at the rioters, shooting them with rubber bullets. And the day afterwards, the reporter said, it seems to me that you guys are feeding each other.
Correct. We've talked about that. And that ends up being the case. Inherently, if you're out protesting and an APC shows up and officers in body armor show up with shields, there's this escalation of defensiveness. And that's natural. Yeah. It's human nature. It's fight or flight, right?
Right.
And so in this case, they're definitely moving into fight mode, even though the purpose of what the police are trying to do is put people into flight mode. And the more this escalates, the less rational we are.
Right. Well, then as a protester, you probably are like, okay, well, you know what? I'm just going to burn the target down because now they have a tank. So it doesn't, you know what I mean? Not all gloves are off. You know what I mean?
I don't even think it's a situation of all gloves are off. I think it's rationality moves out. The purpose for you being there gets lost in the anger at the oppressive, and I say this in air quotes, force. And that's not a good thing. That's not an admirable thing. But then you get the back and forth, and the hate and the vitriol continues to grow. I definitely agree that there is a growing distrust of police in our country, but I don't necessarily think that our media is doing a good job of balancing that. Being a police officer is extremely dangerous, and every news piece I have ever seen where some reporter goes in and goes through training with police officers, goes through the same training that they go through with active shooter training, that kind of stuff, fails. Every one of them ends up shooting the wrong person. 80% of the time in the training. Not saying that every 80% of them fail it. They all fail it multiple times in the training process because it's extremely difficult to know better. Now, in the United States, you can't put Pandora back in the box. We can't take guns away from officers because too many people are armed. But how do we end up doing like you had talked about with soldiers? Like soldiers go into combat zones and are told, don't shoot.
As a Marine, you're told to de-escalate the situation.
Now, how do you do the same thing with police? The irony is a very large portion of our police force is former military, and they're going against the same citizens they're supposed to protect. But there's multiple psychological factors that go into this. One is like, this person is my enemy because they're coming at me to kill me, and then that escalates, and they're trained. You don't injure, you kill, and they're trained that way on purpose, and it has to do with survivability. The other thing is, every officer, every day, out on patrol, all day long, all they deal with are criminals. So inherently, everyone they see is a criminal.
Well, maybe. I mean, like you said, if the homeless guy or somebody, it's been reported several times, like if people have a mental health issue and they don't understand what's going on, that person's not a criminal. They just, they don't even understand what's happening around them. And, if you see somebody... so I'm going to bring this from the outside. I didn't bring it as a source, but there's a podcast I listened to called Terrible, Thanks for Asking. Mm-hmm. Nora McInerney has been doing it for several years. Her husband died and her father died. Her husband died of cancer and her father died. She was pregnant at the time when her husband was... Long story short, she had someone on the podcast that had a son that was autistic, and he was African American. Mm. And he was severely autistic. Mm. And she said, my son is 20 years old. Mentally, he's not 20 years old. And the problem is, if you chase him, he thinks it's a game. So if somebody comes at him with a weapon and he runs, or they run, start running at him, he thinks it's going to be a game. And so now you're talking about this culture of police officers that have been, okay, well, you're violent, you're a criminal. Mm. No, he has a mental health problem,
But I guess that's exactly the point I'm getting at, is when you work with a population of criminals, the vast majority of the time, and your perception is that this call you're going to, the person you're responding to, is criminal in some capacity.
Right.
Because you've been trained that. Like, we're human beings. Through routine, through repeating the same thing over and over again, we learn patterns. Humans are really good at picking up patterns. Now, this isn't necessarily a good thing. So when you respond to that call,
no, it's not. I mean,
and the autistic kid who's 20 years old, but he's probably 6'2" and big. Right?
Yeah, it's an audio podcast, but
that's not.
It doesn't matter.
I'm not talking about the specific individual. I'm talking about the example.
Whoever it is.
You're a police officer, and you respond to this super big.
Just good text.
Yeah, my mom called. Super big kid, essentially. He's a full-grown adult, but a kid in his head who thinks you're playing a game when you show up. Sees the weapon, whatever, grabs his toy because he wants to play along, or he runs because he thinks it's a game of chase or whatever else in this perception. Officers don't know that, so of course they feel threatened and they're going to defend their lives. How do you balance that? And ultimately, I don't think it's defund. I think it's increased funding. Like, Seattle is dramatically understaffed, and understaffing is a big part, in my opinion, of how they're responding. Because
I think I agree. Like, even being a liberal hippie. The defund the police, I don't like. I like the
How's the drum circle?
Like, what?
How's the drum circle?
Oh, we're good.
Okay.
I'm gonna learn the chords for Kumbaya soon.
Cool.
I'm really excited. It's on a Sunday too. But it does. This is a good time to bring up the last article, which you didn't do your homework and read. But it's by the American.
In my email.
Oh, it's by the American Psychological Association. It's called "What Works to Reduce Police Brutality" by Zara Abrams, and it was published on October 1st, 2020. And I just took a couple quotes out of it. I didn't actually write down who said this, but in the article, someone is quoted saying, "Criminal justice, basically police, courts, and prisons, have been called evidence-free zones in certain areas." Meaning once you get to that point, it doesn't matter, which is strange. But they said the crime rate when they've used these new methods, which they bring up, which is called like the power of peer intervention, like Project Able, the active bipartisanship for law enforcement, and they had a few other monikers I didn't write down. When they use different things, like when other officers are said, hey, it's okay to tell another officer to stop doing what they're doing. They bring up instead of keeping your mouth shut, so you're not a rat, you should stop someone from doing something illegal. They brought up an example of a protest that happened this summer where what happened was an officer got into it with one of the protesters and it was getting very heated. And all it took was another officer to come over, put his hand on the officer's shoulder and say, just calm down. Let's think about this a little bit. You know, it's that idea of ironically self-policing in the police, you know, of like, let's de-escalate this. Let's talk this out. You know, let's and I think like
common sense thing that should apply in all levels of society. Period. Like we should, the protesters should be doing this with each other as much as the police officers should be doing it, and it shouldn't be a questionable thing.
Right, but that goes back to the thing of I do think defund the police is terrible. I think it should be their idea of defunding it is, I guess, is that you have failed us for whatever reason. I don't agree with that. I mean, but I'm white. So you've failed us as a police, whatever. So we're taking your toys basically because, you know, go home. And I think this article is important because these are doctors saying when we work with officers, like you just brought up, they're trained that these people are criminals, but like we've brought up and read, not everybody is. Like maybe that germ of a seed in the beginning of you're just fighting criminals. That needs to change. And that also needs to go into, like we talked about in the beginning, about having psychologists or nurses or some kind of healthcare professional with the officer to say, this person is homeless. They have a knife. It's terrible. They're walking around a park, but like they're psychotic. They're not a criminal. They don't understand what's happening to them right now. They don't know they're in a park brandishing a knife. They think they're fighting demons or something. You know what I mean? But
where's the balance, Joe? Here's my question. Like, one, I agree with you, and I think that's how it should be. I don't think we should be spending less on police. I think we should be spending more on police. People will say over and over, like, you keep trying to reform, we keep trying to retrain, and I don't think that's the case. I think putting social workers in with officers as partners is a brilliant idea, and we've seen dividends in it. Finding other ways to respond to things that don't require police officers, I think, is a great way to do it. Like sending people out to take a report because a store was broken into. Criminal's gone. Sending an officer isn't going to do you any good. Yeah. Sending a detective to do investigation work makes sense. Sending someone to take a report that is not an officer makes sense. Like we're piling too much on our police, which
and that's even been brought up by the left of like, here's the dangerous things they actually respond to, which is several studies have been done, but it's like a third basically of what officers do is dangerous. The rest of it is paperwork, like you said, responding to an incident that the person's gone and they're taking a statement. It's like, what, you know, it is important work, but like, hey, there was a murder, you know, a mile away. I need to go look into that. Why am I here taking the statement on this store that got broken into and they just busted the windows out?
And there's a balance in that. That I don't think as a society we have found because, you know, policing is becoming more expensive and departments are are short-staffed more and more and more the more we go. I mean, the irony of all of this going on in Seattle in particular, and the huge demands to defund the police in Seattle, is like less than a year earlier, maybe even only 6 months earlier, there was huge demands and pressure on the Seattle City Council to hire more officers because there had been that fatal shooting in downtown Seattle, and then that had ended up with like 7 or 8 innocent people on the street getting wounded. Like it's a massive shift in there, but I think we need to be spending more money on police. One, for training for the officers, but two, in properly staffing the departments for their needs and kind of reimagining. And I'm okay with the idea of reimagining policing because in our major cities, policing has really changed. Now, in smaller departments, it's not as likely to be done because they don't have the funding. But like even defunding police, the movement here in Seattle that's super pushing for it, they're wanting to do it because they want the money out of the police department to do other stuff. The problem is they don't have a plan.
Yeah,
they have no idea what they're going to do to
I agree with
replace
that.
it.
I'm like, there is a website, I guess, that's got a plan, but it's like bullet points, which isn't really a plan.
A plan.
It's bullet points, Avin. It's all. But I think I agree with you. Like, I think there needs to be more money in police, but I think the point on the left is what I'm reading is the money is all going towards APCs and body armor and better military grade, Kevlar, where it's like you and I are proposing the idea is we need to do these training things like this Project Able. You need to have psychologists there when you become a cadet. No, yes, we want to take violent people off the streets, but not everyone is a
when
criminal.
We're training officers to watch each other's back, it shouldn't just be watch each other's back from getting shot or protecting each other because you made a mistake on the force. It should be preventing that guy from making the mistake when he gets so into the moment that he does something stupid. Like, we should be watching each other's back more than just not snitching on someone. You should be protecting each other's back to prevent the need from it. Like, George Floyd is a perfect example where if any one of those officers had walked over to Chauvin and put their hand on his shoulder and be like, dude, he's down.
Get your knee off his neck.
Like we've got him restrained. You can move your knee back. He isn't going anywhere anymore. Like, you don't need to keep restraining him. If any one of those officers had done that at any point in time, that whole thing never would have happened. Probably.
But that's a cultural thing of.
But the counterbalance too, I'm going to bring up here, Joe, is before I started my little explanation there, you brought up like a schizophrenic person running around a park with a knife. At what point does protecting the greater good of the community require that the officer uses deadly force for someone like that? Remember, I was attacked by a crazy person, by a schizophrenic person with a pair of scissors who was trying to kill me.
Right.
This happened in Lacey, in my car. Remember, the guy came up and like used the scissors like a punch knife? And like, I was in my car, thank God. The window did not shatter, or we would probably not be talking.
Did police get there or whatever?
And so I called the police. The police showed up, and all the officers, and 100% think they did the right thing. All the officers, I believe, if I'm remembering the scene correctly, there were 3 officers that walked up to this guy in the parking lot, guns drawn, pointed down.
Yeah.
All walked up to him carefully, and he literally turned around and put his hands behind his back. He didn't fight in any way, shape, or form. He was... Later on, when I talked to the officer who made the arrest, they called me up and asked me to do a report, and I talked to the guy about it. They said, yeah, he's most likely schizophrenic and probably off his medication.
Well, yeah, I mean, that it's terrible, right? But, like, I don't know. I think, they did the right thing, right? That they had their guns down and all that. But
I'm glad they were there because he was walking towards a grocery store.
Well, no, I agree with everything you're saying. What I'm saying is, like, that should, like, they were probably talking like, hey, he's, keep your, like, it was because they had a level head and said, keep your guns down. He's not right. And to me, I'm just saying that should be the norm as opposed to, something we read about. Oh, because there was something in, I want to say Chicago or Philadelphia where a man was schizophrenic. It was on body cam footage. His parents several times said that he had mental health issues, and the officers shot him. So it's like your situation, but there was more officers, and that was in the middle of the George Floyd protest.
Didn't he run out of the house and like charge the officers with a knife or with a weapon?
I don't know if he had honestly, I don't remember if he had a weapon, but again, like, it was handled differently. Like your situation, they had their guns down, they told him, and he complied. But the parents of this other guy said, he has a hard time. He has mental health issues. He has a hard time realizing. So whatever that guy was off, he had a moment of clarity where he said, oh man, I'm going to get shot or whatever, and kind of stood down. This other person didn't. But that's my point, is in the beginning, instead of looking at everybody, yes, tell these officers in training, yes, you are going to be dealing with people that are violent, that don't know what's going on. They're probably committing a criminal act, but like I think it has to shoot down has to be the exception rather than the rule. And it seems like right now the rule is if you draw your gun, what about a taser? What
I would beg to differ. I would say that because of media, because of cell phones, we're seeing way more of the incidents where officers are shooting than we have ever seen before. And I do think that we're probably finding instances or places where there is either a structural or a bias situation or whatever. Like, I think we're seeing this more than we've ever seen it before. I mean, you'll hear in black communities over and over again say, like, this is how it's always been. You guys are just now seeing it. On the flip side, though, I promise you, in the day-to-day policing in our country, the statistical likelihood that this is the norm is wrong. In 90% of cases, I would say what happened to me is probably the more likely resolution. We're only seeing the bad because that's all anyone cares to share.
Well, it goes back into the argument, though, of accountability, of like, okay, this is the exception rather than the rule, right? Like, we do get shot, but nothing is happening to these officers. They're still on the streets. They go to another department. They go to another city. And like we talked about in the beginning, you never hear about what happened. I actually didn't write it down when I want to bring it up. There is a place I want to tell people to go. There's a project called the National Police Accountability Project. So what they're doing is it is a guild of lawyers that are trying to go after people that are abusing their authority, and they're trying to create. It happened a long time ago. It was very difficult to get a hold of, but like USA Today or Newsweek got a hold of a registry of officers that had committed offenses and where they had moved to. And the fact that USA Today or Newsweek had to do a massive expose to get a list of these people was pretty abhorrent, because you saw some of the things that they had done. Like Norm Sandberg said, the registration is probably important because you can lose your license to practice law. You can lose your license to practice medicine.
You can be fired. A beautician.
Yeah, but police can just go somewhere else. And I think, again, it feeds in on itself. When you see this stuff that isn't accountable, then these people are like, well, screw it then. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, if they're not going to be accountable, then I don't want to be held accountable, which is bad. But like, Norm Stamper did bring up, like, he said the community.
You mean like arresting and prosecuting criminals for committing criminal acts versus not doing it? Holding people accountable actually encourages people to not repeat the accountable thing?
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying is, and there's been, I didn't bring it in to this police accountability because it had more to do with the law, or lawyers, but there is a movement to have maybe special, because prosecutors don't want to prosecute police officers because they need them to prosecute actual cases.
Yep.
So they know if they go and start talking bad about officers, and they're not going to want to testify for them. So there's been movement to maybe have just an organization of prosecutors that just prosecute police officers, like Internal Affairs. And that's their sole goal, because then they wouldn't have the need to just, that would be their sole need. So that way they wouldn't have to ruin their relationship with officers in other cases or whatever. And I don't know. The National Police Accountability Project, you can donate. I didn't just go there. It's NPA. NPAP.com. You can donate. They will send you, I think if you get at a high enough level, they'll send you legal briefs. They'll try to keep you up to date on what's going on. And again, to me, it's about accountability. It's about this idea of, yes, if you break the law and burn down a target, you need to be held accountable. It came out in the news that people that broke into the Capitol, they're being arrested and held accountable. But if police are not arrested and held accountable, or they do these things, and they just go somewhere else, that means something's wrong in the system. Or the fact that police don't want to tell on each other. Again, they don't want to be a rat. But it's the idea of, what if I'm not a rat? What if I'm stopping you before I'm a rat? There's a long process to be a rat. Like, you have to be silent. Well, somebody has to break the law. You have to be silent. And then you have to tell them later. But, like, the moment they're about to do something bad, just, again, put your hand on their shoulder and say, do you want to think about this before you do this thing? You know what I mean? Like,
I read an article a while ago from a police officer in California. And basically he was like, I was a police officer, and yes, all cops are bastards. And I read the whole article because I wanted to hear his opinion. And I do not agree with his positions. But one of the things that they highlighted in the article is they interviewed a female officer who had been fired for standing up and stopping one of her coworkers, like in that moment.
Yeah, see,
that's her position. I don't know the whole side of the story. I didn't witness it. But basically, she stood up and stopped an officer from doing something bad in the heat of the moment. And that the officer she stopped filed a complaint, and then she ended up being under disciplinary action, and they got pulled out. So, like, there's a real fear in policing for that kind of thing to happen, and that also isn't what it should be, right? I bet you money if you talk to anyone who was an idealist becoming a police officer, like, I'm going to serve and protect, would go into it thinking, yes, you're 100% correct. But after being out on the street for several years, especially in a violent city, is far more concerned about not violating the trust of their brother in blue over taking that chance of losing their job or getting fired. And that is another issue that we kind of run into. And again, a place where I think if you're putting social workers out there with the officers, then you're creating that kind of check in the process.
Because they would probably report to a different whatever, right? So they could say, no, you can't, I have to, I have to.
Whoever you're sending out for that social worker, like, the counterpoint to that is going to be like, well, they're going to put me at risk because they're going to get in the way and I have to protect them. Well, the reality of it is the people that take that job as, like, I'm a field social worker with police, is going to have to go into that knowing, like, hands down, I'm going to be in violent, dangerous situations, and I'm putting my life on the line without a weapon, without an ability to defend myself.
Yeah.
And the officer I'm with has to 100% trust that they can do their job if they have to without worrying about protecting me.
I don't know if they'd be completely unarmed. They'd probably have a vest, and they'd probably have a taser, I would imagine, and pepper spray, which is way different.
They would definitely have vests. I mean, they're going to end up being a part of kind of the police force, and they're going to be in dangerous situations, and they're going to want protection. But
no, I mean, I would, yeah. I'd be like, ooh.
I would tell you that those people that are going out and doing it with an officer are probably a lot more comfortable making that approach than they would be if they were out on their own.
Right.
Walking up to someone and being like, hey, let's get you into services. You're definitely not doing right, man. Like, it looks like you're off your medication. Let's get you into the hospital and get you back on some meds.
Let's do some tests and stuff like that,
I'm going to have to ask you to turn around and put some cuffs on because I don't trust you not to hit me or stab me.
Yeah, something like that. I don't know. I think it, yes, there needs to be more accountability with citizens, obviously, and stuff, but, like, that's a point, like you said earlier, if your job is to serve and protect people and, you look at everyone as a criminal, there's a presumption of innocence in our justice system of everybody is innocent until proven guilty.
Correct.
And if police show up to a thing and just think, well, he's guilty, he did X, Y, and Z, that's, I think, a massive cultural change. Norm Stamper talked about it, in the cafes after a bust or something. They wouldn't have these conversations. They wouldn't be like, man, was he off his meds? They're like, well, I don't know. He's in a body bag right now, you know. But that thing of like just them sitting around going, ugh. Again, I hate to beat a dead horse, but like, you know, when we talked about it in the first episode, I thought about it a lot about, especially now I had to take a break from conservative media because it was wearing on me. Just like I feel if you had to listen to some liberal media, you'd be like, come on, man.
I will tell you, listening all the way through that Norm Stamper interview was difficult.
Was it?
Oh,
it was
yeah.
only like 30 minutes or whatever.
Oh, man. But like, yeah, the things he was saying were really grating. I listened to it. I listened to his viewpoint, but
Oh.
I mean, he was completely in
book?
support. Like, I'm cheering on those asking for 50% defunding. Like, he was
Right.
like, let's do it. And no, like, and the ramifications of defunding and not hiring police officers are rampant just here in the city where he was a police chief. Like, the violent crime and the things that are going on in Seattle right now are awful. And it's 100% directly related to this culture of, like, defund the police.
It's
don't
just
hold
like
people accountable. If it's not a violent crime, don't put them in jail. Right now with COVID, I mean, that's part of it, but you're seeing all kinds of issues with it.
Yeah. Well, to me, that again goes back to feeding into it, where we don't feel that you're holding your officers accountable, so we're going to take away your money. And then the officers say, fine, I'll have this whole department quit instead of responding to an emergency thing.
But that's
and then
not
you
what's
create
happening.
this
Seattle isn't backfilling positions as people leave. They were already short-staffed, and now you have the Seattle City Council basically setting police policy, saying that, like, don't arrest people unless it's a violent crime. Like, this is policy. This isn't officers being retaliatory. This is policy.
Well, I don't know. I mean, again, I think the defund thing is terrible. It should be like, we need to refund the police. Look at you know what I mean? Like the way we fund the police. Do we need an APC? Do we need body armor? No, we probably need more psychologists down there.
And if we want to restructure police to make what we call a police officer become what a police officer is meant to be, someone that responds to violent crime, someone that protects people from violent crime, someone that performs these policing duties where they're policing the laws of our society and not basically being nannies to
people with mental illness, when they're not trained in that, that's not their training.
And we're stacking more and more and more on officers. If we want to restructure it, police are going to become more expensive. They're going to need more money for a while we create this restructure before we see benefits of the new system. Like, you can't go in and strip all their money and then try to rebuild in behind it, because society is going to go through this extremely painful, extremely violent period. What'll end up happening is you'll have people coming back going, no, we made the wrong choice. Bring back the police. And it's not ever actually going to adjust or change.
Yeah, that's true. Again, I'm liberal and everything, but I think the defund the police, it seems horribly misguided. But again, Norm Stamper did talk about that in the difficult podcast you listen to. But the idea that the community needs to be involved in these processes as well. You need to have committees of citizens saying, hey, we're not really talking, like, defunding is kind of a bad term. We're talking about refunding you or funding you in a different way. Like, how many psychologists do you have on staff with you? How many mental health experts do you have on staff? Like, oh, none. Like, you guys aren't, or maybe we need to retrain the officers.
At least locally, that's not the conversation being had, though.
No, but that's what Norm Stamper's talking about, is like, we need to have these conversations. We need to sit down and say, oh, you guys aren't trained in mental health issues. We need to do training for these officers in mental health issues, because they will come into contact with people that have mental health things
And I don't necessarily, I'm shaking my head, but I'm not necessarily in disagreement that we need to be equipping officers to handle the situation. The thing is I think you're stacking training on top of training, on top of training, on top of training, and you're just asking too much from one person. If you went to your job, Joe, and they were like, hey, we need you to be a Class A truck driver, a cabinet installer, we need you to also be able to do the books for the company, you have to do the accounting, and while you're at it, we also need you to do sales and customer service.
No,
like,
I get what you're saying.
And you have to do it all in an 8-hour day, and you need to tasks flip like 16 times a day. Like, it's too much. You're not that's not your skill set. That's not where you operate best. We
Right,
need to
yeah.
enable officers to do what officers do,
Yeah.
and
No, it.
pull
Yeah.
the roadblocks out of their way. We're asking them to police our laws,
Yeah.
so we need to enable them
it's
to.
right. I think we're saying the same thing, but in different ways. Like I just think there needs to be a cultural, like Norm Stammer said, culturally this needs to change, and they need to have support and the community needs to be like, okay, the police are changing, so we need to change. Like we can't, but that. It isn't a thing with minorities. It's just I think across the board.
And I do think that having the community involved in the process is very important, because the community can really outline, like, here's what we're looking for. Here's what we want. That is the job of city councils and mayors. Like, they're supposed to be representing the people in this context, but definitely here locally, like, the people don't feel heard or represented.
Right.
There's such a huge level of distrust. They just don't feel like they're being heard, which is why we have the police accountability office here in Seattle that does have civilian oversight, and they do pull camera footage and review anytime any complaint is filed, and they do watch.
Yeah, I think body cam's important too. There's been talk of, because some places you can actually turn them off at certain times. So there's kind of this movement right now to be like, hey, the moment you pull them off the charger in the morning, they're on, and then the moment you put them back on the charger in the evening, they turn off. You're not allowed to physically turn off your body cam. So that way, if there's a discrepancy, or a citizen even says something, about the police, that can be reviewed, instead of like, oh yeah, we lost the body cam footage, because that happens too. Police say that all the time too.
My challenge in that civilian oversight and having civilians in there, and I'll come back to in a minute the body cam thing, is that unless you have been a police officer, or unless you are a police officer, you don't know what they go through on a daily basis. You don't know the stresses they face. You don't know that constant, several times a day, is this going to be the violent situation? Is it not? When I pull someone over for running a red light, when they, pull a plate and see that it's a stolen car and they walk up or try to run, like, is this going to be the situation where I don't go home? Like, is this going to be the situation where I end up on the news? Like, there's so much pressure to be perfect, and also simultaneously, like, just do their job, that it's really difficult for someone who's never done it, who's an academic, to sit there and be like, you need to do this thing. Well, like, you don't have any idea what I'm going through. And so there's communication barriers that are going to be extremely difficult in that type of conversation to progress. Conversation has to be had, and it needs to be done. And I don't disagree that there needs to be some level of accountability if an officer does something horribly egregious. The thing with the body cams, I think, in my own personal opinion, I am surprised that there is pushback within police departments on body cams. Now, I don't know all of the reasoning. Like, I haven't gone in depth into the actual pushback, but for me, from a logical standpoint, like, I would want a body cam, imagining myself in that situation, because that body cam to me is like, no, here's the evidence. This is why I did what I did. Here's the reinforcement for it. Moreover, like, I would imagine that body cam footage would be inherently admissible in court. So when you deal with someone, like, who is like, no, the officer did that, and the officer's like, are you kidding me? Like, I've got my body cam footage right there. There's like 3 cops that have it recorded. No, you're just lying through your teeth.
Right.
Like, you would, you would think that. But I don't know. I don't know what the counter arguments are to it.
I mean, I don't know either. But like you said, if you're on the up and up, if I think that most officers are on the up and up, they'd be like, yeah, like, I don't know, record me, sure. Like, I'm following procedure. I'm not using excessive force. I'm not, And then again, that goes into retraining. Hey, you did push this guy down, and he was already, he had his hands behind his back. It's like, oh,
I mean,
like
combat fighter pilots all the time are constantly watching their gun footage, their flight footage when they go back to get better.
Right.
So even from a training perspective, body camera footage could be like, okay, like, we got lucky here, something bad didn't happen, but we would, what I would call in the logistics world when I did it, a near miss. This is a near miss. Let's use this as a training exercise. Officer Jimbo, I probably shouldn't use Jimbo, but Officer
his
Smith.
first name's Jim. His first name is Jim, and his last name is Bo.
Officer Smith, like, we've had this complaint. Yes, you operated within the law, but we're really on the edge of it, or maybe we're in a gray area. In this situation, maybe we should do this or that. And pulling back out and kind of wargaming the situation a second time is a fantastic way to train. I'm 100% in support of the concept of body camera. I just don't know what I'm missing because I'm not there. Oh, yeah. And that, I think, for both of us is the one place that we do kind of have to agree. We're having this whole conversation, but at the end of the day, we're just average citizens looking in and have no idea.
Yeah, but I mean,
on.
we use police. Like, I don't like this argument at all. I'm going to disagree with you because I'm not a chef, but I've gone to a restaurant and been like, that's an amazing meal. I've had interactions with officers before where I'm like, that was a great interaction. And I've had interactions with officers where I'm like, what the heck was that?
So have I.
Like, I wasn't, and so like this idea of like, well, we don't know what we're talking. It's the same thing of like, you hear it on the right-wing media all the time of like LeBron James, like, hey, just stick to baskets, and you're like, come on, man, you just had Ted Nugent on. Like, stop it. Like,
but honestly, on the same note, Joe, using your chef analogy, if you have a disgusting meal at the kitchen, are you going to go back to the chef and be like, hey, here's what you did wrong? Or are you just going to go, this meal wasn't very delicious?
No, I'm going to say that was a terrible meal. And if they ask me, they're going to be like, did you like it? I'm like, no, I didn't. Like, I'm going to be honest. And that's the conversation you have with,
but
like,
when we're
did
having
you like
a
our
conversation
policing? No.
about setting policy,
yeah,
like, you're basically saying you know the recipe better than the chef does.
No, I'm not saying, I didn't say that in my analogy. I said, did you like the pasta? No, I didn't like the pasta.
Correct.
I'm sorry.
So we can give our opinion and give our insight, but it's not us at the end of the day who are really going to be able to make the decision. Like,
but like we just
George
talked
Floyd
about it.
Died. I'm not happy Philando Castile died. I'm not happy that Tamir Rice died. Like, these are all terrible, terrible tragedies that never, ever should have happened. But on the flip side of it, like, I can sit in my armchair and espouse my theories all day long, but I don't think I have the right to set policy to fix it.
No, I mean, but that's what this podcast is a conversation, right? And the idea is we are citizens that use police and we pay for police with our taxes. So again, like we just talked about, having that conversation of community saying, hey, I didn't like when Officer Smith pulled me over and like, look at his body cam footage. He was very rude, and it's all that stuff. So like the idea of like, well, I don't really know if we know. It's like, no, we don't. But like as a community, you have to sit down and say, this isn't, what is happening? Like, this isn't acceptable. You can't turn your body cam footage off. How come we don't have footage of this arrest? Like, it's just, that's what we're doing. Like, do you want to end the podcast? It's only episode 2, Avin. What I'm saying is we're having conversations.
I'm done. No, that's definitely not what I'm saying. The point that I'm making is that this, like, we can discuss the issue all day long, but I don't know that I'm the one that's qualified or you're the one that's qualified to set policy. Now, admitting, we're not sitting here trying to set policy. I think we're talking through the issue. This is a particularly extremely difficult thing to figure out. How do we solve this issue as a society? The conversation definitely needs to be had. How do you or I, how does the person listening to this podcast affect that? Now, I think the National Police Accountability thing is something that is a good resource for people. I actually really appreciate that you shared that.
Well, yeah, I read about it a while ago, and I don't know if you can do digital contribution. It looks like you have to mail them a check. I got to check that again. Maybe I was on the wrong tab. But it's the idea that, like, it would, like, yeah, like you and I, we don't set policy, but we are citizens and we do use police. And so our input matters. If there was a town hall meeting that I could attend where they were like, hey, we're talking about police accountability, I would go there and just listen to people and say, this is what's going on. And like, I agree with this. I don't agree with that. This thing of like, well, you're not an expert. Well, like, that's part of what this podcast is about, we talked about at the end of the first episode, you didn't really know about the name of it, about the grief of politics, but like, especially after the Capitol attack, like there is grief in the fact that like you and I disagree on a lot of stuff. But there's grief in the fact that we saw what happened at the Capitol, and there's a percentage of people that believe so, like you and I talked about it last week, that we don't think the election was stolen. We think it was fair and square, but other people feel differently about it. And the fact that instead of everybody just sitting down and having a conversation going, yeah, I disagree with this, I agree with that, it turned violent, and there's grief in seeing that, and there's grief in these communities when you see the George Floyd incident, where you say, what are 3 other officers doing standing there where that one has his knee on the guy's neck for 8 minutes? And there's grief of these parents that have to go to these meetings and go, you shot my son. Like, and yeah, I'm not a cop, but like you just killed my son, like it. So like, how do you get together as a community and talk about stuff like that? And like, again, we're citizens, it's our duty to vote and vote on policy and speak our minds, as long as we're not violent or saying things that are disrespectful to people. Like, we can have a civil discussion.
Or inciting violence.
What? No. What? I didn't really use fomenting a lot in my life until January 6th. And then after that, everybody used the word fomenting in the news. And I was like, I know what that is now. I didn't know what that was until the 6th.
The point I'm making isn't necessarily that we shouldn't have this conversation. The point I'm making, I think what I was trying to get at, is that like what's going on in Seattle right now is the people are going to the city hall meetings and they are going to the council meetings and they're calling in and they're demanding policy changes. And at least locally, and I don't know nationally, but I would suspect nationally at some degree, cities are just doing what people are asking them to do, and they're not doing their jobs anymore. They're not discussing what's the right way to fix this problem. They're like, well, people are mad, so the point I'm making is that these politicians that set policy in our cities are letting the rioters and the protesters dictate their policy decisions, and that's not right.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. They are, but they, the rioters would say, this is because of the police actions that we're making this. Whatever. I
know where the rioters' position is coming from. It's just our elected officials have a responsibility to do the right thing and to govern our cities, not cave to pressure from a minority that's really loud.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Anyway, I mean, we can keep talking about this, but do you want to announce what the next topic is, or is it going to be a surprise for next week? Because now next month, you get to pick the topic next month.
It'll be a surprise. I forgot we were doing the back and forth.
Oh, okay. Well, that's fine. It's episode 2. I mean, you have time. We cut the conversation short. I mean, again, we'll probably come back to it. I mean, we did talk about the first episode in this episode. We'll probably
inherently, and the topics are, somewhat related because, of course, we're going at conservative ideology versus liberal ideology. And again, I will caveat me being a conservative. I am conservative in that I am a libertarian. I am not.
So yeah, you're the problem. No. You see conservatives dunk on libertarians all the time. You're like, what's happening over there?
I am not a Republican. I do not side with the Republican Party. But I do think that my position tends to be more as an independent voter. I'm going to vote for what I think is the right thing and follow the policy that it is the right thing. I'm not just going to listen to the politician that I identify with and let them set my policy and decision making for me.
Yeah, I mean that's true. Like, that's the idea. Is like, that's why we're doing this podcast, is because I do think these things we're talking about. There is grief in these things when these neighborhoods have to come together, especially with police reform, and say what happened to our neighborhood, what happened to our children, what happened, even police, what happened to your husband or wife. They were just on a patrol. Like it's this big thing of just grief, and I think there is grief in politics. The fact that you and I do agree on climate change, the fact that there's some people that think the earth is flat and that there's nothing you can do for climate change it's frustrating, where it's like, man, that's really frustrating. Anyway, so I guess, what?
The earth isn't flat?
No, you should read. There's some history books. There's some science books you should read. Oh. I heard a new term in the conservative media. It was called scientism. Anyway, we can talk about that later. But so this is episode 2 of The Grief of Politics. I'm Joseph Carlson. This has been Avin Carroll with me. Again, this is episode 2. We're still trying to find a flow. I usually do solo podcast, and Avin doesn't really podcast that much. So yeah, he's shaking his head right now. So yeah, I mean, it may have been a little messy, everybody, but we'll figure it out. If you want to write to us, you can go to my email address for the other podcast. That's gwgpodfellows.com. Go there, write us a line. Let me know how you found the show. We're just on Apple iTunes because I'm an old man. I don't understand how Google works with the Play Store, or Spotify. So we are on Apple iTunes. We will do some research and try to figure that out. We're working on the website right now, but we have art. for the podcast, and we have a website that I will have to redesign. So hopefully it'll be up by the 20th, but I imagine it'll probably be up by next episode. So, and then I will give Avin all the login information so he can also edit the podcast. Is there anything that you want to plug, Avin, that you've been working on? I know you're doing stuff. You got your own stuff going on. Is there anything you want to direct people towards at all? Any kind of projects?
I don't know that this is an appropriate place to do that. At least not at the moment. No.
Okay. Well, I'm going to plug my stuff because haha. So I have another podcast called the Gaming with Greed Podcast. It hits my website every Monday at 7 a.m. Go there, subscribe to that podcast. It is on a completely different feed. And then again, if you want to write to Avin and I, write to gwgpodfellows@gmail.com. Go there and let us know how you found the show. And we're on Apple iTunes, their podcast, Apple Podcast. It's the Grief of Politics podcast. It has a red background. Anything else, Avin, before we sign off?
No, I think we're good for today.
Oh, yay. Cool. Well, I'll probably I'll talk to you in the coming weeks. And then, again, next week will be a surprise. So, yay.
Not next week, next month.
Right, next month will be a surprise.
Correct.
So, yeah.
Don't want people expecting weekly podcast here. We're doing this on the 20th of each month, like we said in the first podcast.
Yeah, that'd be terrible. All right, well, everybody have a good month, and we'll talk to you next month.